So hello and welcome everyone to Rainbow Space Magic 3.0. This is the Writing Short SFF panel. With that, let's get on to our panel. And why don't we start with Jennifer for an introduction.
Hi, I'm Jennifer R. Povey, and I'm known for writing everything from epic fantasy to stories for analog. My pronouns are she, her, and I am wibbly wobbly sexy Rexy, as you can see. That's a lovely shirt. And in the short fiction front, I have sold a queer short story to analog, that bastion of progressive science fiction, as people see it. We will talk about that.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, my name is Sarah Pauling. I'm an international educator in Seattle. I write mainly short fiction. I've sold to a variety of markets, include Clark's World, Strange Horizons, Escape Pod, and some others. I also slush read for Diabolical Plots, as Monique knows. And so I get to spend a lot of time kind of digging into really punchy, like kind of 2000-ish word stories, which I think has given me a nice sort of viewpoint into what really hooks me in a story. And I also am an associate editor for Luna Station Quarterly, which is another genre magazine that promotes women's science fiction. And I believe in the Q&A, by the way, did we fix the chat so that it's open now? Awesome, yeah. Thank you.
Should work for everybody.
Yeah.
And Kristin?
Hey, I'm Kristin. I publish as KL Noone. I'm published with JMS Books and a few other places too. I used to be with Less Than 3 Press. I write lots of things from contemporary to historical to paranormal to sort of high fantasy, especially medieval. I've published things from short flash fiction in the 5,000 and under words to 300 word super flash fiction, and the next one of which will be out in the next queer sci-fi anthology, which is exciting. So I do a lot of short work, but also all the way up to the giant 250,000 word epic that came out last year. So I write at all sorts of different word counts. And my novella Frost and Rain was a Rainbow Award winner last year. So we can talk about that. And in my academic life, I also teach college kids about Shakespeare and superheroes, and I'm part of the International Robin Hood Studies Association.
Hey, that's great. So my name's Monique. My pronouns are she, her. I live on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, which is Ottawa, Canada. I guess I write mostly short fiction because that's what other people have published of mine so far. I've had a story published on Diabolical Plots, where I am also a slush reader with Sarah. And I have had flash fiction published in various queer sci-fi anthologies, like Kristin, including the upcoming one, Clarity, which is out on October 5th, and you can pre-order at all the regular places. And I've had a number of stories published in the Bikes in Space anthologies that come out from Microcosm, including another one coming out this fall. Yeah, I describe my work as queer families in space, which I think it's actually mostly queer lesbian families in space, to be really specific about what I write. So there you go. Anyway, so I think we can start with the first question. We're going to take turns with that.
We each came up with some questions to talk about. So we wanted to start with that whole idea of first defining what a queer short story and a queer science fiction, fantasy, speculative short story even is, right? We're on the short stories panel. So what does that mean? Does it have to be written by a queer person? Does it require openly queer characters? Where's the intersection with speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and maybe even short story? So how do we define some of those things? Jennifer, do you want to start?
Well, first of all, for defining a short story, I use, oh dear, sorry. I use the SFF definition, which is a short story is up to 7.5 thousand words. Under 1,000, flash fiction, everyone has a different definition of. As for queer, I think anything a queer person writes is going to have queerness in it, no matter how hard we try not to. But I believe that I do not know if a straight person can write a queer story, but they can certainly write about queer characters, which also would count as queer SF, as long as they're doing it respectfully and not listing their characters. But I think ultimately a true queer SF story is it's a short story that explores queerness in some way, and that can be literal, direct, or metaphorical.
Oh, I love that. I love the idea that it can be very literal or very metaphorical. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, as I was pondering this question, my answer got less and less specific, which I feel like is the opposite of what I was trying to do. But I do think that's kind of makes sense to me, because if we're looking at sort of queer from also the queer theory academic perspective, you've got that sense that queer is left so intentionally broad for a reason, right? The idea of queering the text is to take something that we expect and sort of turn it inside out, whether they be categories of gender or, some people read it very broadly as, the categories we take for granted of many kinds. You can be queering the text. I think that that's a valuable thing to have, that broadness, because it almost feels counterintuitive to me to say like, well, this is and this isn't. So I appreciated what Jennifer said about like, there can be an element of metaphor there as well that I would not exclude from the idea of a queer short story. I also feel, for myself, I feel strongly about it not being tied definitionally to, the identity of the author, because often we're reading that identity from the outside. So while in theory, I could see there being sort of a comprehensive way to say like, this is a queer story because this author is queer, I think there's so many situations where we as readers will never really know that I don't find it a very valuable rubric for my own reading. So we end up with situations where an author either feels the need to sort of like claim their queerness before they're ready, in order to like get that label in some spaces. Or we end up in a situation where maybe an author doesn't know that they're queer and they're using this fiction to explore those ideas before they take that label for themselves. That was certainly my situation when I was young. So to kind of think through, yes, this might not be, the author may not define themselves as queer even, and it still may be queer fiction. And there's just so much, again, ambiguity in that I'm happy kind of putting it into a definition of the work itself. Yeah. I think also that to some extent, sometimes it's more about the reading of the work than the writing of the work, because again, queer lens. So you often end up even with a work that was not intended to be queer with some really interesting queer readings. I mean, you talk to people who like Sherlock Holmes and you'll open interesting conversations. But yeah, so as I thought about it, my definition grew less useful. So there it is.
May I add a little something?
Yeah.
I do not mean to identity police. Identity policing is completely wrong. People get forced out and you get, oh, no, you are not, as a bisexual woman, I get, you do not have a sufficient dating history to sell your stuff as queer fiction. So I just wanted to say that that's not what I meant. But even if the author doesn't know they're queer, their stuff is still queer, even if they aren't recognizing it yet. And I definitely have known more than one egg that's hatched true fiction.
Mm-hmm. And I've definitely gotten, I don't know if I've ever had someone say that to me, but again, as a bisexual woman, yeah, that comes up in my head all the time. I've got an editor being like, well, but like, you don't really have that, a strong dating history that proves, you're queer. And I have to kind of fight that editor voice.
And the question is always, why do you have to prove that?
Exactly.
And that sounds so much like some of the things I had written down in my notes about the audience and what they bring to the text versus the actual writer and intention, and there's things you just don't know about the writers, and especially sometimes even writers from older generations where you just wouldn't know, or we find out after the fact. I was thinking about some things Grant Morrison was saying on a panel a couple, I guess last week, about very, very late in life coming out as a they. Do we go back and read their early work any differently because of that? Is it always queer work? I would argue it's always very queer work in a very different sense. But what does that change, and what were audiences responding to already, back in the 1980s? But before I say things, Monique, do you want to jump in and answer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of what I was thinking about has already been said by Jennifer and Sarah. Because I was thinking of it too, and the more I thought of it as well, the more sort of my thoughts about this were, less certain. And that, I mean, I certainly consider everything that I write queer, whether it's explicit or not. Like I just feel like that, that it's what I write is part of me, and so it is necessarily a queer story from that point of view. But I also think it's interesting, that the whole idea, as you mentioned, Kristin, about like going back and looking at stuff. I mean, I was writing for a long time before. I didn't come out until my late 30s, so I was writing for a long time before I sort of thought of my identity like that. But I think that stuff is still, retrospectively queer and probably was in some, respects in that otherwise. But I mean, I think that, when we talk about, what makes it queer, it's like, I mean, I it's non-normative. It's, it's a, not, sorry, what did I write? It's unconventional by definition, sort of thing, right? So, in that sense, does it have to be explicit? I don't think so. Although I do find myself when I'm writing, especially for a submission call, and it's, wanting something that is explicitly queer, that I go with the explicitly queer, that I give somebody, past or present relationships that sort of define their identity, or just thoughts that define their identity in some way in an explicit sense, and especially with shorter stuff, because I feel that the shorter it gets, the harder it is to sort of be more subtle or be more implicit. I think some of the time, whereas when I'm going for like not queer places or places that don't have that, I'll write stuff that's more subtle. I wrote a story that was published by Diabolical Plots about a robot on Mars that I think is inherently queer, but I mean, I'm not sure that other, it wouldn't necessarily be read that way by everyone. So.
And that was something I had in my notes for this question too, the idea that something about it should be identifiably queer, whatever that means. Maybe it's metaphorical, maybe it invites that reading, maybe it's as simple as one line as a character thinks to themselves about their desires, or not having had a relationship for a long time or something. But to give queer audiences something to kind of reach out and find and see themselves, because that representation is still important, considering where we are currently. It would be nice if perhaps it didn't matter, but it still really does matter to be able to say that character is like me in some way, or this setting accepts queer people in some way. This is a historical alternate universe, but queer people exist, right? And so I think some element that's recognizably queer in some form, I think, helps define that queer short fiction. And what you said too about short stories, sometimes you have to establish that up front, you have to establish it quickly. Jennifer said the thing that had my notes about length, about defining short stories according to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America definition. And also thinking about speculative fiction and kind of fantasy and sci-fi, it's such a perfect venue for exploring the non-normative, right? For exploring things that maybe we can't talk about in, quote, realistic fiction, right? What can we do that we can't do in other genres? What can we play with gender or language or identity or societies? So to come back to that question of maybe what a queer SFF short story is, it's that space that opens things up for us.
I think you just gave me the perfect segue into the next question.
I try.
May I take that? Because the next question on our list is, how does the short fiction form lend itself to exploring queerness specifically? What can we do in the short form that might not work as well in, say, a novel, or for that matter in another historically hetero-established genre? I did not come up with hetero-established, but I'm stealing it.
Sorry, very academic sometimes.
And I will pick on Monique to start.
Okay. Yeah, so I was thinking about this a lot. I think this does tie in very well with the first question, right? I mean, I think that part of what makes the short form sort of more appropriate or helpful, or or that for queer writing is that it lends itself towards exploring the unconventional. I think that a lot of experimental forms, a lot of just unconventional, non-normative approaches to storytelling are very much better explored in shorter forms. And that's not to say that there are not novel length or series length stories that are very experimental or very different, or all of those things. There are, and some of them are incredibly successful. However, having said that, I think that there are a lot of concepts that we explore in speculative fiction that lend themselves to the shorter form, because they're not going to hold up over a longer thing. And sometimes it's just, I know for myself, sometimes it's a very specific thing that I want to write about, some very particular idea that I'm thinking of exploring, and the shorter form, it is the appropriate one for that, because again, would that hold up to a novel? Maybe or maybe not. Do I want to write, devote the time to exploring that very specific concept or queerness, over the course? Yeah, no, maybe, maybe I want to spend a month working on that, not a year or 2 years sort of thing, And I do write, I'm starting a novel right now, but so I do write longer things, but I feel that there are a lot of things that I want to explore, a lot of what ifs that lend themselves to this. And I think then the other part of this is that not that it's easy to get short fiction published, I'm not saying that, but there are a lot more platforms for short fiction that explore sort of queerness, identity on a broader scale, very specific things, and so it makes you have more possibilities for publication. Whereas with a novel, there are small presses, there are places that will publish a whole range of wonderful things, including queer stuff. But I think when you're working with short fiction, it's a bit, again, not easy to get published, but there are sort of more places. There's a lot of anthology calls. There's a lot of platforms. There's websites and magazines. So you have that sort of this bigger range of possibilities, I think. So that's my take.
Okay, Sarah?
That was a really good point about the platforms. I hadn't even thought about that concept of there are really specialized calls that if you want to read stories about queer cowboys, there's a science fiction call for that. That's really exciting thing too, I think, about short fiction. But I was also going to agree with you on the idea of the shorter form, or sometimes the more constricted form, ironically letting you play around so much more. You can come up with a really interesting frame, which lets you, again, look at something a little bit non-normatively, lets you play around. But also, if you don't like it, you can just start over, especially if it's flash. Really, I find myself writing more and more flash with that sort of mindset, like, all right, I can do whatever I want, because if it's not good, it took me 2 hours, and it'll need revision from that point. But the first draft can be really playful, because I know it's not going to eat up a year of my life. So I can really play and really try new things. And that includes themes. I wrote a story that's in Clark's World called Informed Consent Logs from the Soul Swap Clinic. And it's about body swapping as like an industry, a neuroscience industry. And there is a sub theme of gender and queerness around gender, because these people are trading bodies for different reasons. But I'm able to come at it from, I think, an interesting angle, because I have that. I told the story as a series of consent logs, so sort of script format, noting places where the recording was different. So that's something that you can kind of play with and do new things with, and kind of let your mind free with short fiction. I think it's kind of interesting, because you guys talked about how short fiction, often you have to sort of lean towards the more explicit with the shorter word count. Ironically, there is like a length at which I find I can really revel in ambiguity in a way that I don't always do with my longer works, like when I'm writing a novella or a novel length work, because you can set up sort of the strictures of the world and get it set up at the beginning, but then once you've done that, I think you don't need to explain, or you probably shouldn't explain, every digression and every facet to keep the story streamlined. So some things like a queer desire or relationship, I find that I can kind of sit with, yes, this is a queer relationship, but like what that means, where they're going from here, what happens next for them is ambiguous. And I think for maybe some of us who came to terms with queerness late, sometimes queer desire can feel like this sort of other, or this thing that doesn't fit in, especially if you've been told that it's not possible, or it's not something that makes sense. To kind of claim and to sit with that, like, it doesn't necessarily fit in the strictures, and we can kind of play with it and see what comes of it in a short story, is kind of a freeing feeling, if that makes sense.
And that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I was thinking about was short stories as a good place to explore those feelings that are maybe uncomfortable, or feelings of dislocation or alienation, or something that's strange or different. Not to be horribly academic, but to use the darker Sufan term about cognitive estrangement that you get with sci-fi and fantasy. And those are things you can do in a short story really well, when you're not asking your readers to sit there for 200,000 words, but they can do it for 7,000 words, and you can have that experience, and not everything has to make sense or be explained, and that's okay, right? You can be part of the story and be swept up in it and experience that particular distilled, crystallized experience. Afterwards, you can go away and think about it, and think about how maybe it's shifted your worldview or challenged you to think differently about something. Short stories have that immediacy in a lot of ways that novels or longer form things, you can take a while to build up. You can do slow, leisurely plotting or foreshadowing or all of those things. Or if you're Stephen King, you can write 12 books of something. But with short stories, you're making a particular point, and it's a very specific point, and it's this single little sparkling jewel of a moment versus a whole giant treasure chest you can swim around in. And so whatever you're doing with the short story, there has to be something that's focused to it, whether that's linguistic play or style or experimentation or just having fun. And I absolutely love that point about being able to start over, because once you've got 50,000 words of a manuscript, you don't really want to start over from the beginning. But if I've got 500 words, sure. I think I rewrote my story for the Clarity anthology at least 2 different times. Well, maybe 3 times, but the first one was a different idea. And I realized very quickly it was going to be a much bigger idea than 300 words. So that got put in the metaphorical drawer and it will be something else later. So the length is also good for paring down, what do I actually want to say? What do I specifically want to say in this moment, in this particular story? So it's great for focusing in that sense.
All
If I
very
can-
good answers. I would add too that while the longer form gives us more space as writers to explore things, the amount of white space we need to use in the shorter form often gives readers more chance to explore a world that we haven't defined and to bring their own perspectives on it. And you can just sort of guide them into, and you can have to into that, but you can also let them, the reader is the final collaborator. And that's something I'm very big on. The reader is the final collaborator. Everyone is going to read a story a little differently. And the nice thing about short fiction is that everyone can read it differently without contradicting anything. So you can actually give them a little bit more space and let them play with it, which is why I read a lot of short fiction.
I really like that. Yeah. And I think we have sort of a sub theme of, if we're defining queer fiction, we have to include the audience, as collaborators. If I can rec a friend's work, because it just makes me think of this conversation. Stephen Grenade has a story called The Sigillist Notes on the Fell Lord's Staff in Baffling Magazine. And it is about the servant of a Dark Lord who is obviously deeply in love with the Dark Lord. Obviously. And it's a beautiful and kind of sweet story, actually. It's like basically if you were in love with Voldemort, but it's sweet. I promise it's sweet. But the way it ramps up from ambiguity is because of the form, right? So it's told in the notes of the sigillist, like making work notes, but you can see this sort of this thought pattern that's in there and this care, and then it ramps from that interesting ambiguity to being explicit really cleanly because it's a short word count. It's a piece of flash fiction or just over. And so that sort of combination of sitting with ambiguity for a while and then the clarity of the short fiction to get it where it needs to go at the end, being this ramp into this more explicitly queer story, is really, really beautiful. So I would recommend that for sure.
Can I suggest that we type all of our recommendations into the chat, please, so that people can get?
I was just thinking that.
It's much easier for the audience.
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of audience response and reader response in short fiction is, of course, fandom and fan fiction, right? Because it's so easy to write missing scenes or bonus scenes, or we didn't get to see this on the show, but here's what I think happened after the end of that episode. And that's sort of the purest expression of an audience that takes something and looks at it and says, well, here's what I think, and here's how I read that. Let me rewrite it in the way that I viewed this relationship. And of course, fan fiction is such great training for very short things. If you're writing flash stories, or you're writing for a challenge or a gift exchange, but then also having the freedom to write something longer if you want to. And so thinking about the creative space too for readers to talk back to your work.
Agreed. And speaking of being able to play more in short form and being able to kind of do things without pressure of a longer work, or even a professional, like trying to get it professionally published. I mean, I definitely know many people, myself included, who learned they could write because they tried some fan fiction, specifically queer fan fiction. And getting that space to play and respond to someone else's work without a lot of pressure was really, really formative, I think.
And if you want to read reams upon reams upon reams of queer fan fiction, just go in the Pern tag. Pern fanfic is, some of it is smut, just saying. Sometimes that's what you want.
I had someone write fanfic for one of my longer novels, which I read a little bit of because it was going in a completely different direction. Not something I was ever going to write, but it's such an odd, surreal feeling to be on that side of things, to be like, oh, well, now I'm that person that other people are reading this and saying, well, I'm going to write this story based on that. Like, it's delightful.
Career milestone. Career milestone.
It is. AO3 tag.
Just don't read it. Just don't read it. You don't want to read it.
That's amazing. I would love that. Okay. Well, I have our next question, which might not be as long, we'll see, but we have a good, collection of readers as well as writers here, and we wanted to each maybe recommend a short story or a couple short stories, ideally queer SFF, and then also one of our own pieces, if we feel that that's we have a piece that would be especially relevant to the topic, which I assume we do. So to kind of call in order, I will go Kristin first.
I have, of course, so many things on this list because it was so hard to pick. And I realized as I was thinking about it, oddly enough, the short stories I tend to read are by authors I kind of already know. And I get excited about that. Oh, you wrote something short, let me go read it. Or alternately, authors that are doing something really cool and weird and interesting, maybe with folklore or kind of combining genres or playing with steampunk things. But the two that I'll go ahead and recommend to start with, and the first one you might know if you're a reader of kind of queer sci-fi, fantasy, romance things, Alexis Hall's Liberty, which is actually set in his Prosperity universe, but it's standalone, so you don't have to have read Prosperity. But that one's got steampunk and queerness and non-binary sky pirate captains and airships and criminal masterminds, and it's tons of fun. And part of the fun of that is that it's not actually a healthy relationship. They're very bad for each other, but they keep coming back to each other, and there are these little glimpses of maybe there's something more, they make each other better, within that. And the world building is fascinating, and the whole story has this sort of combination of 19th century Dickens street slang with a sort of made up steampunk vocabulary where you have aeromancers and kind of H.P. Lovecraft inspired monsters. So Alexis Hall is a ton of fun. That particular story is Liberty, but there are a bunch more. The other one is actually by a friend. It's Ophelia Graham's Pine Tree Mary, which has a lot of fun with Scandinavian folklore and holders, which are forest spirits, but they're traditionally female. So what does it mean if you have one that's born male? So there's some playing with gender and identity. And also in the background, this really interesting plot about crime and eco-drama and people using the forest as a place to, make money and make a profit. So that one's also interesting for a lot of reasons, and queer in a lot of reasons. And there's exploration of identity, there's a central romance that's sort of complicated, but also these questions about kind of the forest and lives that are intertwined with nature. So that sort of human, non-human queerness as well. And then if I want to throw in, and I told you there were a few on this list, in the sense of reading things that are queer that maybe weren't necessarily intended to be, although maybe they were, I'm going to give you a weird one, which is a Lord Dunsany short story from 1908, which I actually teach sometimes. It's The Sword of Welleran, which you can read a lot as a commentary on heroic kind of epic fantasy, and I think very much a critique of epic fantasy. It's sort of about a young man who picks up a magic sword that used to belong to his hero, who was sort of a legend who saved the city back, years and years ago. And the young man picks up the sword when his city is in danger and goes off to fight the invaders. But at the end of the story, after he kills everyone, he does kill everyone, but he drops the sword and he cries because of what he's done. But there's some really interesting cues that lead toward a queer reading of this story. The young man in question, first of all, the story makes a point of him being obsessed with fashion and outfits, and oh my god, the clothing in this story is amazing. Second, he is, I would say, especially for 1908, very emotionally expressive. He gets moved to tears by a lot of the legends and the heroes. And then very literally, the spirit of the dead hero that he sort of worships comes to him in the night and enters him and possesses him. So if you want to read that as a queer ghost story, you absolutely can. And in fact, I've kind of played with the idea of writing it the other way around, but I feel like I read it as a queer story in the sense of non-normative masculinity and emotion and this kind of rejection of that ideal, but also there is a whole fanfic there about how the hot, sexy, older ghost comes to him in the night and enters his body. So if you want a story from 1908 that fits with that discussion we were having. Things of mine, one of the most recent, if you like high fantasy, would probably be the 12th Enchantment, which was actually written for the JMS Books 12th anniversary short story call. It's set in the universe of my novel Magician, but you don't have to have read it. It's new characters. But that one's got a magician and a prince sort of reluctantly falling in love because neither one of them wants to, but there's also fantasy setting and elements in the background. There's sort of a fantasy mystery. There's missing mage students and they have to figure out what happened to them. So there's also that happening. And then also, if you want super short flash fiction, A Penny for Your Thoughts is under 5,000 words. And also high fantasy and has the new local magician who has to deal with a silver penny that makes you tell the truth if you touch it, which is extremely inconvenient.
Jennifer, why don't we go with you next?
Okay, so I have two stories I'd like to recommend. Excuse me here, I need to pull up the spelling of somebody's name, otherwise I will not get it right. And one of them is a story that has the distinction of being the first Hugo nominated story to have Twitter listed as its publisher. And this is a little story called Unknown Number by Blue News Stifter. And no, I bad German names. I will put it in the chat. I literally had to have it up in Google because, and this was nominated for a Hugo this year, and it is a beautiful exploration of transness that is perfectly appreciable by cis people. And the other one is a little more lighthearted and entertaining, and it's a hench helps her villain no matter what by by Izzy Wasserstein, and it is a story that explores the inherent queerness of superheroes and the inherent kinkiness of superheroes. It's not explicit, it is kinky, but it is kinky in a, PG-13 way. That's right, and it is on Escape Pod. It was published on Escape Pod in February 2020 and is still posted. The audio is still up, so listen to it because the narrator is fantastic. But it's a story about a supervillain's henchwoman who is, I almost forgot it, but then you mentioned the Dark Lord guy. It's a very similar story. She's actually hopelessly in love with her mistress, who doesn't have any time for her because she's too busy tying up hot heroines. As for my stories, my most recent queer story sorry, I can't talk and type at the same time. My brain won't let me do that. Is A Song of Starlight, which was in the July-August analogue this year. And believe it or not, analogue has become a very queer-friendly outlet. If what you are writing is fairly rigorous science fiction, the current editor is perfectly fine with as many space lesbians as you want to send him, put it that way. Right, and that's a story about a polyamorous family traveling through space, and one of the spouses is the ship. So it's an exploration of gender, forbidden relationships, AI, and believe it or not, is being taught by a community college, which was like, what? So I have to use that one because, and if people can't find it, talk to me, because sometimes finding old analogs can be slightly challenging, but your library probably has it if they have a decent science fiction collection. Oh, that's all.
That would be an instant buy for me, so I'll try to find it. Monique, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I actually did sort of restrict myself to one recommendation to another, and that is John Wiswell's DIY, which came out on Tor.com last month. And here's the link. And I love everything he writes. I think his stories are amazing. DIY is the story about a boy who wants to go to wizarding school, but he can't because of the medical debt that his family has because he's disabled. And it is a wonderful story. And it is, I mean, it's sad and heart-wrenching, but it's such a beautiful, uplifting story. And I think, you know, queer in both ways that we were talking about earlier. And, you know, it is this queer platonic relationship, these ace characters, like it's just, it's a really wonderful example, and I loved it so much. Anyway, I would also recommend all of his other stories because I actually had a hard time choosing one but I thought DIY is newer, and it is just such a fabulous story. And so anyway, so that was my restriction to one, but it's really author, not a story. As to my own work, as I said, I have written a number of stories for the Bikes in Space anthologies from Microcosm. And so the one I would say particularly that I think sort of, I like all my, but the one I like most is called The Sound of Home. It was in Dragon Bike, a book about bikes, feminism, and dragons. My dragon is metaphorical, but it is about a queer family living on Enceladus, which is one of Saturn's moons. And yeah, for me, it sort of summarizes my queer lesbians in space, queer lesbian families in space sort of thing. There's a child, there's a bike that works on an ice moon, and as I said, metaphorical dragons. And anyway, links to all my stories are there. And yeah, so that's it.
Unlike the rest of us, Monique can follow instructions.
Nice. So for mine, I also restricted to one, but I really need you all to read The 22nd Lover of House Rousseau by C.M. Fields on Diabolical Plots. It is a beautiful story. It is about an android who is living in this sort of space fantasy future, basically, where she is basically bought for massive sums of money by, you know, one lover until the next one dies, and, you know, her whole existence is meant to kind of form around that person. But I think what sets it apart is it's told in this very beautiful Baroque voice, and, you know, you've got that sense of heightened sort of beauty and emotion of the world, but also you get to watch her progression of incorporating the emotion of rage into her definition of love. And it's a really beautiful story as she kind of, like, speaking of redefinitions, like, she redefines love for herself. And it's just really well told. So I would really recommend that story. I think that probably a good one for me that fits the topic, The Dame with the Earth at Her Back, an Escape Pod. Speaking of space lesbians. So this is a story set in sort of a retro futurist outer space with a comedian who has sort of resigned herself to being quippy on this out of the way moon in a nightclub where she works, but is kind of drawn into a resistance movement against her totalitarian government, against her will at first, because of a really attractive spy that she doesn't realize is a spy that keeps coming every night, and she finds her very attractive, but also she accidentally heckles a very important intelligence handoff because she thinks it's a drug deal. So then the rest of the fallout is her kind of getting swept up in everything. So that one, if you want something that kind of fits my work, it's very voicey. It also has a female lead that might be a little annoying. I think that might be my signature. So my favorite kind of milieu, also a space lesbian story. Unless we had any of the recommendations, I'm looking at the time. I would love to have a little bit of time for audience questions if we have any.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any.
Yeah, feel free to type them into the Q&A if you've got them. We have a few more minutes.
Please don't be shy.
Ask us things. Sarah's last line about annoying heroines was reminding me of Jane Austen commenting that she's writing Emma and she's going to write a heroine that nobody's going to like except herself. Of course, Jane Austen didn't have space lesbians, as far as I know.
Not yet.
Now I really want to rewrite Emma as like space lesbians on a lonely outpost somewhere.
Public domain. You can. Just saying. I will enable. I will enable.
Yeah, for sure. I would enable that. Absolutely. I do. I love an annoying female heroine. I also love a unlikable or mean female heroine. I'm happy either way.
There's a tendency for, we have a question.
Introduce a character in under a sentence. Make it a really long sentence. So the question is how to introduce a character in under a sentence. There are tricks to do that. Honestly, I'm not joking. I think that it depends on how voicey your story is. But if you're really firmly in the head of that character, I find it kind of helpful to give us an extremely explicit but kind of irrelevant detail about their life or what they're doing that is just, deeply specific to them. Like I am actually a fan of rambling first sentences. Some people might tell you not to do that, but I think if the character's voice is like that, having, I have a character who's like talking about, well, I'm sitting out on my porch and this is happening and God forbid that happened, but anyway, this is what happened. So
I do that too. I hate opening sentences because I always feel like I'm trying to establish so much.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it's about what the character's feeling more than anything else, or what they're thinking. Description can maybe come later, or maybe not at all if we're very tightly in their point of view. One of the ones I used for, I think, the previous Queer SF anthology started with something like, Cyan was annoyed because there were students in his office again. And you already know that he has students, he's in the office, he's annoyed about them, and they're here again, and they keep coming back. And that already tells you not necessarily the plot, because the plot starts when somebody else comes into his office, but it tells you something about who he is and where he currently is and what he's feeling at that moment.
Yeah, I think grounding in an emotion is a really good thought because, I think a lot of people try to ground in a moment of action instead of a moment. Well, it could be a moment of action, but if the focus is on the emotion, you're more likely to form that human connection than watching the hero do a cool trick.
We are often told to start with action. That's actually a rule for television, not prose. I'm not saying that sometimes, I have started a novel with pew, 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 pew. I'm not saying, but that is mostly a rule for visual media. And I will say that I often sometimes do it by breaking one of the most common rules of short fiction, the thing you're told never to do. Start with dialogue. Sometimes
I do that all the time.
It's to start with dialogue. But the other important thing in a short story is, if it's not relevant to the story, we don't need to know it. Which means I have many short fiction characters. Hair color? What hair colour? It's never mentioned because it's not relevant.
Mm.
And the reader will put on to that character a physical appearance. It might be the physical appearance of somebody who shared that character's name, but you don't necessarily need to mention in a short story, unless it's relevant, the hair colour. Now, if you're writing something with a bit of romance in it, the hair colour may become very relevant. Or if somebody's going around with bright blue hair, picking on you, Sarah, because your hair is awesome.
It happens.
Then then the hair colour can be the way to introduce the character right there.
Yeah.
You don't
I
need,
think-
if it's
Oh,
not
sorry, go ahead.
relevant to the story, it doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Let the reader fill it in.
That's a really good rubric, especially because then as you're writing the story and you start understanding the themes of your own story, you can define the character in a way that is thematic, and all of a sudden it's, you know, it's relevant, and you can kind of use that to decide what part of the character is going to feel interesting and complete within this story, because it says something about the themes, and you can still have a character in that. But,
You mean you know what the themes of your stories are? I usually
No.
have readers tell me what they are.
well, notice I said as you find out what your themes are, because it's never in the first
I
draft
usually
for me.
plan mine out. Somebody says, hey, this
That-
story is about X. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it's kind of it, isn't it?
Well, that's where I find it's helpful when you're writing towards a submission call, right?
Yeah.
So for example, the QSF, you know, flash fiction contest where it has a theme, you know, laid out for you. And it's like, I, you know, keep going back to that and keeping that character and world building really small, because 300 words, you don't have a lot of space. But,
We are kind of at time. There is one more question in the chat. Do we have time? I guess I'll ask this of Monique. No, okay. All right. Well, in that case, I think we can wrap up.
Well, we do have, there is a channel in the Discord if people want to continue the conversation there. And I know I certainly will look in on that when I have a chance. So.
Come say hi to us on Discord or this afternoon in the kind of wrap everything up chat on Zoom too.
Yeah.
We will be around. Thanks for coming. And in the case of California West Coast people, thanks for getting up early to be here.
Joining us. Yeah, so the next panel will start on the hour. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.